Buckle up for AEC Trailblazers, the Founders Files, where we crack open the stories of the brightest minds in the AEC startup scene. Forget institutional pitches. We're diving deep into the real personal journeys of these industry disruptors. Get ready for some casual chats firsthand.
Hello, and welcome everybody to another episode of the AEC Trailblazers podcast, where we interview the most amazing founders from the AEC. Today with us is Vardhan Mehta. He's the co-founder and CEO of Acelab, the AI-powered materials marketplace connecting architects and manufacturers to make specification faster, smarter, and more sustainable. A former architect trained at Pratt and Harvard GSD, he brings practitioner-level rigor to product data, performance criteria, and supply-side transparency. Recognized on Forbes 30 Under 30 Manufacturing and Industry on 2025, Vardhan now leads a platform used by 15,000 AEC firms, including 80% of the top 100, to align design intent with cost, code, and carbon expect time. Vardhan, welcome to the show.
Super excited to be here, Valentine. Thank you so much for having me as a guest. Appreciate it.
It's an impressive bio, and I wish I was able to be on the Forbes 30 Under 30, but I'm too old right now. But did I miss something else from your bio?
No, I think the most important thing in my bio, which you didn't miss, it's just not available everywhere online, but I'm a second generation architect. So that for me, beyond the vanity titles from Forbes or anything else, that for me is the most meaningful thing. In that, I grew up in a small town in India and was obsessed with like the practice, profession, industry from a very early age. It would spend a lot of time with my dad on the job sites on Sunday mornings or in his office after schools. And that really gave me an appreciation, not just for the role that an architecture firm plays on a project, but also how important it is, to collaborate with the other stakeholders internally and externally. So that's the only thing I would add to the slide.
I mean, it's a great thing. And just out of curiosity, he was like a design architect, construction, both, or?
Yeah, he did like different things, as the career evolved. So initially he was more, let's say, the design architect. And then over time, as the project started to get larger, they stepped away from, the design, and they were more the architects of record. And then beyond that, they started doing smart cities for the government. So they expanded into urban design and planning as well. And I think for me, the most interesting thing was, the relationships I saw at that point. I understood that like this industry is like really, really highly dependent on relationships. And my first instinct when I came to the US while I was in architecture school was like, well, maybe this industry, the same industry in the US is a little bit more driven by technology or efficiencies and all of these other things. But fast forward to now, I've come to the conclusion it's still very relationship based. So it's not all that much different.
Well, it's a reality. I mean, if you're gonna spend so much money and you're gonna work for so much time on a project, because that's a reality, every project takes at least 2 or 3 years. Like you rather work with somebody you trust than somebody you don't know. It's a reality. It's so risky, and I think the same applies to technology products, right? Like you get to be a unicorn after, I don't know, 10 or 15 years in our industry. Maybe less if something like that happens to Acelab, but I think it's the same. I don't know if you get the same feeling with on the tech side or not.
For sure, man. I mean, I think like something that's happening a lot in tech, thinking about architecture firms, is there's a lot of piecemeal solutions in the market. And being an architect, I can appreciate the value of, and this also feeds into relationships where like ideally you want to minimize how many tools you have in your tool stack, and like the analogy I always use is like for firms to have an Allen wrench or a screwdriver to fix like small things in the process is one thing, but having the entire toolbox available is the other. And that for me is really interesting, like thinking about tools like Revit, which even after all the gaps that the industry knows well that exist in that tool, even after all this investment and acquisition from Autodesk, I think the reason why it is the system of record is there's enough value across the workflow where it keeps the users in. And that's what I think we really appreciate here at Acelab too. I think the other part is like, I feel a lot at architecture firms, there are tools that work well for the BIM team or the sustainability or the spec writers or the architects or the interior designers. But those tools often don't really talk to each other. And I remember like that also leads to a lot of headache inside the firms where one of the components on the project team would like the others to use their tool, but it's not the best tool for those other job titles at the firm. And so those are like some of the the dynamics we are being very mindful of with Acelab. I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about how we're doing that. But I think those things for me have been a good insight into what it takes for AEC technology to be successful in this, in this next phase. And of course, AI has a very big implication on that too. So, I think like my general sense is there's too many tools around right now. We need to minimize those to systems of records or single sources of truth in a way that is valuable for not just one fraction of the firm, but really all stakeholders internally and ideally the external stakeholders as well.
Oh, absolutely. And it makes sense. And before we get into the weeds of the great things that Acelab is doing, I'm just curious how you ended up with this vision and how do you decided, like you said, like there are too many tools, and do you started working as a designer, being an architect, and then you realized there's a problem here and you decided, you know what, I'm going to solve it myself? Or how was the process?
Yeah, so I was practicing in New York, doing projects for the State Department, which were like US embassies around the world, institutional projects for MIT and Yale. And during that time, I think I recognized like three big things about the technology we were using. And for me, it was like very close to heart just because I'd entered practice in 2016. And so I had this like interesting experience where in my personal life, I was using a lot of technology. And then at work, I was using, on one hand, a tool like Revit that was being used across all the project teams, across all the stakeholders, again, internally and externally. But then on like the material side, the technical side of practice, it was a library inside the office that nobody liked to manage or upkeep, hundreds of manufacturers' websites, reps that like nobody at the firm knows how to contact, BIM libraries which are like totally out of shape, and all of these like very scattered ways of digesting information. So my two big takeaways on like what was lacking beyond the design documentation, which Revit and the other BIM tools handle very well, is the other side of what the architecture firms need is, number one, ideally a data ecosystem which has all the pieces of the puzzle in one place, meaning you don't have to go to one side for sustainability research and one for finding BIM objects and one to find the product specs or to write the three-part specs, and then for the price, the code requirements, etc. Ideally, you have all the pieces in one place, just because that's how, as architects, we make decisions. We don't make decisions only based on aesthetics or sustainability or the performance, but we have to factor all of those in and the trade-offs required to make a decision. Sometimes we try to make a decision only based on the aesthetics, and then halfway through the project, half of those things get weeded out. So that doesn't really help anybody on the project. On the other side, I realized that it was incredibly manual and a headache for all the pieces of an architectural team to keep in sync the drawing set, the schedules, the spec sheets, and your BIM model, right? Like anytime we make a change, and that's still the reality right now. So it's already been 9 years since I started to think about this or appreciate this from my practical experience. But to an extent, at every firm, you make a change in one place, and you have to keep a mental record of applying that change also in those other three documents, which at the end of the day are the deliverables. And I think the more like higher level reason why all of this was important to me is I realized that when it's too hard to find the right data or workflow tools, it's too easy for architecture firms to repeat the specs, that we've always been using. And understanding, and I'm sure you'll also appreciate this with your background as an architect, but where the practice stands right now, material selection or specification is one of the most influential places that architects can wield their influence to shape the final outcome on the project. But again, that requires the right data and all of the data and the right workflow tools on the other side. So it's truly end-to-end. And that eventually led to Acelab. As I was starting architecture school at Harvard, I met some architects who had the same experience in practice. And we felt like there had to be a better way, not just between architects and manufacturers to collaborate, but then also the architects, the owners, the contractors, in how we go about making decisions on materials and projects.
It's just when I hear you like on this problem, it's just insane on like the edges of the problem. First, like you cannot access the latest information on manufacturers, and like you said, every architect is creating their own database on an Excel or whatever, and that shouldn't be their problem. It should be something on the manufacturer side. It's just so stupid, right? It's like you trying to buy on Amazon and things not being available there, and you need to find who's selling that to purchase it through Amazon. It's like, doesn't make any sense, right? And then I think that the second piece, when you mentioned that, is a reality. It's like every time you make a change, you have to modify it everywhere, and that leads to a lot of errors. Like so many times I've seen specs that are not updated, or the specs are updated, but then the drawings, you go through revision 1 and 2 and 3, and the materials don't match. It's just a lot. It's just a lot.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's like a cost that architecture firms pay, and there could be different flavors of that cost. If you don't have all the right data, and if you're making your decisions based on your historic data, it still requires you a lot of time to dig into all your folders to find the spec that you wrote 2 years ago for a similar project and to copy that over. That stuff in 2025 should not be a thing. That should be totally automated. Another challenge is the architecture firms who are trying to keep up with manufacturers' data options available in the marketplace. They're doing that at the firm level. So, to go back to your Amazon analogy, let's even leave aside the act of having to buy a product. Even, let's say for doing research, if we had to go on every manufacturer's website to build a spreadsheet ourselves, to add all the data points in, to share with the others in our household to make a decision, I mean, just imagine how much that slows you down. And what is the opportunity cost? Which really is the valuable time, design time, or being able to do more work with the same headcount at the architecture. And so I think these are some of the things that we routinely hear about from architecture firms as well. Something that is really important to mention here is, we've got a fantastic team at Acelab. The first individual I'll mention is Dave Lamont. I think, Valentin, you've spoken to Dave now a few times. So for folks who are tuning in, who haven't had a chance to meet or hear Dave speak yet, he formerly was the CEO of Revit when it was acquired by Autodesk. And I think that experience for him, he has a very good appreciation for the mechanics of architecture firms, how they operate, what is the most important thing for them, and why there's so much value in end-to-end tools, as opposed to something that only does a small fraction of the job for for any team member at an architecture firm. Beyond that, we truly are a team by the architecture industry for the architecture industry. And so meaning 80% of all folks, and again, your team has worked with a lot of them, they come with an architectural background. I think that for me has been really important, and that your listeners will laugh at this, but I remember, due to the passion I felt and the frustration I felt about this problem, the V1 of Acelab, I actually designed that in InDesign because that was the only tool I knew. From all the presentations that we do at architecture firms, I was like, what do I know, need to be able to visualize this or to show my idea to others? And as you can imagine, InDesign is not a tool meant for UX design. But I felt like it was so important for me to like try to find a way to translate that into some way of visualizing it. And since then, we've come a long way. I mean, the latest thing we've done with AI, which is truly amazing for the industry, is now immediately within the architecture firm, we can get some of their historic documents, and our AI can immediately identify all the products they've used in the past and can digitize their firm standards or the material library for them on the fly. And so day one, architecture firms that start using Acelab for material, like the decision making, they're not starting from a clean slate, which I think, again, as an architect, I appreciate a lot. If you even have all of the data, but you have to go through your historic data to transfer that in, that's a huge hassle. And there's a cost of change to that the next time you have a deadline and you need to do a project. So we've automated that part. The other part now at this point we've automated is, for the first time in this industry, we've launched a plugin for Revit where there's a two-way sync between Acelab, where architecture firms keep all of their specs, schedules, any data from the materials, keynotes, and tags as well, that can in real time be applied into Revit. And that for us has been a really big ask from the users of the platform, which again, I think, it goes back to the point that there were probably some users that started on Acelab and they were like, hey, I really need my BIM team to also start using this. And then they helped us to understand what would it take for the BIM teams or, say the design technology team members to also be really excited about Acelab. So that for us has been really important, in that first we have the psyche as architects in how we make the decisions for the product roadmap, but we're very much user-led in how we're expanding Acelab.
No, and I feel that the approach you're taking, it's great in the sense that, like you said, it's not about just providing you the material so you can do the research, which just that alone could be amazing, right? You can automate the whole research and purchasing process, but also integrating to the guys who are designing the building itself, right? When you're integrating with Revit, it's not just about, hey, you know what, you can just bring the data back and forward, but it's actually giving the power to the guys who are designing to pick whatever material they want directly from Revit. And I feel that changes it all, at least on my experience. When I speak with architectural firms, they end up having one guy or a couple of guys managing the library. And then every time they need to pick a material, they have to go to that guy. It's like, you know what? I wanna use a material here. What material should we use? And then they need an email, and that should never happen. It's like, if you're designing the building, you should have the tools to do it directly from the tool you're using, right? It's just,
yep.
It's just incredible. And
by the way,
here, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
I was just gonna say that I'm curious on the sense that how is at the beginning, when, I mean, you have to gather all this information of the industry, right? All these materials, and that's extremely hard. How was the process, or how is the current process? Because I bet you still deal with manufacturers every day. So how do you do that process?
Yeah, I think that's the part that we grossly underestimated, because, our goal was, we don't want this to be a platform where we just list a few manufacturers in a category. We wanted to make sure anytime, we launch a category of the products on the platform, it could be windows, but if we have almost all the windows available, all the manufacturers available, who are operational in the US, but then also we are very deep in terms of data points. So we wanted to optimize this for 100 plus data points, which includes all the design options, all the downloads, resources, all in one place. And so the most important thing for us to understand was the thing that does not exist in this industry is a language of materials, or a taxonomy, so to speak. So if you think back to Revit days, some point they probably had to make a decision on what is the taxonomy or the tree of how we list views, or how we list the data points or attributes inside families. And that's like an infrastructure that you can build upon. It's like a foundation of sorts. And so that's what we did. We started to build out taxonomies to describe any kind of a window using that as an example, that might exist. And so that means like you have to go after every certification the window might have, all the sizing options that may be possible. You need to build that into a model, and then you start to get all this like raw data online, which we're doing through AI. And we keep this in sync like every 30 to 60 days. But this data we map into our taxonomy. That's a big challenge in the industry, and that like we deal with a lot of unstructured data. And you would think like, well, if information is available on a manufacturer website, how is that unstructured? Well, the problem is architecture firms on a project have to make 200 to 300 decisions like this. And behind every decision, you have to evaluate 3 to 5 manufacturers. So when you have to deal with all these manufacturers and their assets and their websites, information that should be structured, if you only had to do that for one manufacturer, immediately is now like totally out of shape, just because you're trying to structure the data yourself very manually, painstakingly, every time you're making the decision. So we've essentially done that work for architecture firms where they don't need to structure the data. And that really allows us to do some really cool things. So an example would be to compare a product, apples to apples, instantly. Could be 2 or more of the products from the same manufacturer or from other manufacturers. If you're dealing with structured data, you can do that like that. It's always at your fingertips. Another like really important thing is, you mentioned libraries. I would imagine you were referring to BIM libraries that architecture firms have to keep up to date. But usually architecture firms also have a sustainability team, or it could be the design technology team. And those teams also have to keep a library. And then somebody has to figure out a way to keep those 2 libraries in sync inside the firm. That's a lot of work. And these times, like we're saying teams, but at the average architecture firms, as you know, it's a few people at best. We're not talking about a robust infrastructure where they have, they can invest resources to go and to keep the data up to date or the BIM families up to date. And that's the kind of stuff we're automating with Acelab so that time can really be spent more meaningfully across every member of the project team, not just, the project architects or designers.
Oh, that's a lot. And when you were speaking about the taxonomy, I imagine a good example is IFC, right? When somebody decided, you know what, we need to define a way to define how a model will behave. The problem with that is that that's perfect when you want to exchange BIM models, but then when you want to exchange information about materials, the only definition is window and a certain time of window. And when the first time I tested Acelab, for me it was overwhelming, not because of the platform, but it was overwhelming from the standpoint that I've never done the job of deciding a product. And even when you decide a product, there are variations of that specific product that you can customize to your project. So there's a huge work that architects do whenever they need to pick this. So having a taxonomy, I bet that in the future you can even be the IFC of the industry, right? Because even if somebody else creates a new Revit or something, you would rather prefer to use a taxonomy that has been proven and works than start your own, right?
Right. Absolutely. And I think like that's like a great way to look at it, because I think IFC, the promise is of course huge. I think there's like, like a lot of nuance, which I'm sure you and your listeners are well aware of. But I think with Acelab, if we can be the common language across the project team. So again, not just the architects who need to select materials, but everybody else who is responsible to document to document the decision in like your BIM file or in your specs, your schedules, your drawing sets. Ideally, those things should be so automated that you don't need to worry about changes or applying the changes every single time, every single place. And, I think we saw the complexity of all of this as an opportunity, in that if we lead with the language, this infrastructure of how can we organize the data, this industry size data for all the materials, the value is really big for everybody that's involved on a project team. So again, like not just architects, but even the owners and the contractors. And also it's an opportunity for architects to be more future-proof in how they deliver projects and how they think of like the value of their time, which no longer is to like reconcile the changes manually, but it's to more focus on, are we making the right decisions in the first place?
I imagine like kind of like an owner, right? An owner going into the platform and being able to decide, you know what, I don't like this door. I know it's a stupid thing to say, but I don't like this specific material and I want this variation. And they can even change it and automatically gets updated on the model and design and the specs. And that would be ideal, right? Because sometimes architects have the power because they are the only ones who have this data and they're in this mess of data. But if the data is organized, you can even give the power to the owner to take more decisions, right? Because like how many times have you seen architects on the owner side that want to take decisions, but they don't want to get into the weeds of a specific architectural studio because there is no way. There's too much data, too many processes, right? And,
Yeah.
and it ends up being emails going back and forward. It's just a mess.
Yeah, and I think like, that's really when data either gets scattered or siloed. So, and one thing that's really important for me is that in this industry, all the collaboration that needs to happen, regardless of if you would like or not, that's often a double-edged sword. On one hand, you make smarter decisions. On the other hand, there is no decision on the project that is made by just one of the OAC, right? There always has to be a conversation. And so by that, I mean, let's say we still want the architects to be in the driver's seat. How do we accomplish that with Acelab? Number one, for the owner to get view-only access into their library on Acelab, that's really valuable, where the owner can say, hey, I saw the thing you picked. Can we find some options which also offer XYZ for the finish, right? Now, the way architecture firms do this right now is they will, every time an owner asks a question like that, they have to go to manufacturers' websites, find the data points that may be good options. They have to add everything into a spreadsheet to share with the owner. And a week later, the owner might have had a trip to Lake Como in Italy, and they saw something else, and you're like, you know what? I changed my mind. Forget about the email from last week. This is my new requirements for tiles, and that's just the fucking tiles of the project. There's all of these other things that architects have to juggle on a daily basis. But if it requires you to keep on doing this manual effort, yeah, like at some point you totally tap out. Another example is with the contractors. So this happens so often where later stages of the project, the contractors will say something like, hey, we were too late to start the RFQ process. The things you've chosen as the basis of design or in your spec no longer available. Here's the contractor grade version of that we would recommend instead. Now the ball is in the architect's court to either just approve the substitute or to go back and invest more of their time into research to find a product that might be a superior alternative, optimizing for something that's important to the architect. It could be the sustainability metrics, it could be the aesthetics, it could be the durability, etc. Any factor that's more in line with the design intent, right? And that is a challenge right now. Like oftentimes architects just have to submit to the owner or to the contractor in that example. So for me, like, if we can give architects more authority on the project, like that is a good thing so that they can exercise the authority also backed by data. So for an architect to be able to show the owner and the contractor, hey, here are all the options available. Here is what we recommend, and here's why. And they can show on the same screen the cost thresholds, all the performance metrics, aesthetic options. That really helps everybody across the team to make a smarter decision.
That's so interesting. And how do you think AI, or what role do you think AI will play? Because I imagine it could be something from just even help you design the materials real quick to, I don't know, give you a sense of previous projects, or what role do you think AI will play, not only what you guys are already doing, but in the future for Acelab as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. So things we're already doing, which are starting to prove to be incredibly beneficial for architecture firms, owners, manufacturers, few of these stakeholders. Two things I'll highlight here. Number one, I think like knowledge retrieval or intelligence behind decision making is one big thing. I'm going to give you an example or two in a second. Second is automating documentation and updates. I'll also give you an example of that. Let me start with knowledge retrieval. So, when we launched the Material Hub in March, we had this very interesting thing happen where a lot of the largest firms in the country, they started to play around with the tool and reach out for demos and so on. And they very well knew the fact that our AI recommendations engine, it factors in 3 data points to return a result to the user. Number one is it learns from what are the previous decisions or selections that an architecture firm has made. Again, the way we do that is we get their documents or spreadsheets or standards while onboarding them, and then we're using that essentially as the baseline. The second thing is data from the manufacturers themselves. So if there's like certain requirements that are absolutely required to be met, then we use that as a second layer. And third is the keywords from the user itself in natural language. So for the first time now on Acelab, without having to run into any advertisements or sponsorships or a paywall even, architecture firms can go up and just say, I need flooring in the cost range needs to have an EPD, and it's for a project in this, this city. And we factor in all of the data points. We analyze what is the architect actually needing on the project, and we return recommendations that match all of those requirements. So that's one really good application, which requires architects to know the problem statement really well, like what they're trying to accomplish, but don't have to spend hours on end on manufacturer websites or search engines to find all the relevant data needed to make the final decision. The second thing we're doing, which is really interesting, and you're, of course, your team is helping us with this, is automating the synchronization of data between Acelab and Revit. And so we're automating things like the keynotes, tagging, which are required by every firm. Every firm organizes them slightly differently. And it's always a headache, like having to figure out, go through your entire section and schedules and look through the keynotes and make sure they're also synced in your drawing sets and so on. So that's the other big application of AI, where we can immediately understand from historic documents what are the keynotes, and we can just show all those tags and stuff to an architecture firm in one place when we're onboarding them. So the next time they're syncing a project to a BIM file, we can automatically show them that data. So those are like 2 really big applications with AI. And again, I think the general sort of thread is how can we minimize the manual data entry, having to keep a mental note of all the changes you need to make in a way that's also really responsible. The last thing I'll say on AI is, as we started to speak with these firms, like the top firms in the industry, the first thing they mentioned was like, our firms have banned AI. And then I was like, well, then why are we talking here? Because like we are an AI company in the architectural space. And so the nuance that started to become really important, and I think like that's a great thing for architecture firms to evaluate tools based upon, is I learned that a lot of the big architecture firms, or I should say the mid to large sized architecture firms, have banned the general use AIs for a few reasons. One is, of course, avoiding liability lawsuits due to something you found, like some junior architect found on the website, and they took that from a chat GPT or Gemini, and it led to some real issue on a project, or at the very least, time wasted around the table. The other really big issue is hallucinations. So if even like you try to build on top as an architecture firm of a chat GPT, there's a lot of fine tuning that's required to make it work. And even then, you don't know for sure if it always has access to the right data, so that if you ask something like, when was the last time I used Anderson Windows, and show me the BIM file I used in the last, like the last time I used Anderson. To get the tool at that place, it requires a lot of fine tuning. And so the reason I feel like architecture firms have been embracing our AI is it's trained on the right data. So our head of research is a technical architect with 30 years of experience. And so all the taxonomy data points, we QA this with a team of 50 architects in-house, beyond using AI to get the raw data. I think that's really important for like generating the responsible AI adoption at architecture firms. And that seems to be something that architecture firms are also looking for. Like, AEC tech companies who are doing something really special with data and how they leverage AI to serve architecture firms, as opposed to the architecture firms having to figure out how to make a general AI tool work well for them.
No, it makes total sense. Like, I mean, one thing is using an LLM for something that it's an informal question or something that doesn't matter, and something different is picking materials or creating a spec or whatever based on the whole internet data. I mean, doesn't make any sense compared to, in your case, you're building AI based on the database created by architects for architects, and it's a completely different story, right? And it makes total sense. Do you also think that AI might be even help on making decisions more efficient, like cost, or like, hey, you know what, I decided to go with this material, but you know what, did you have the same material with this, I don't know, same quality but less cost, or I don't know, whatever, or hey, this is more expensive but the quality is better. You think that suggestions like that might also help improve design in a big scale as well?
I think at the very least, it would absorb the manual research work from architects, responsibilities. So that's also something we're doing with AI, which is like immediately when we load in a new firm, we onboard them through the historic documents. They immediately see Acelab recommendations, and they see that, hey, I see in your library you're using XYZ manufacturer or product. I found you a superior alternative, which might help you to optimize for sustainability. And so the goal with that is like to help, like to arm architecture firms with all the data to convince not just themselves, but also the owners and the contractors to make a smarter decision. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I think like the fact that AI can have this like wealth of knowledge that can accelerate, the decision making. At the end of the day, we don't want AI to even try to make the decision on a project. There's all these like nuances that, as an architect, they might be very close to having an understanding of. And so what we want to do is like arm architects with that toolbox, the complete toolbox they can take to the project, and it helps them to get more of the control on the project, as opposed to having to submit to any other stakeholder just due to the fact that I don't want to spend my time to go down a rabbit hole for optimizing XYZ on a project, or I don't have all the data in place anyway.
Oh, that makes sense. And how do you see, I know 10 years might be a long time, but Acelab in 5 years, like a midterm, what do you think is the future of Acelab in 5 years?
We're really broad in terms of what we want to do in the industry. We definitely are going to stay in the material space. This year alone, we've expanded to owners. So now we've got real estate developers or institutions like Harvard University or brands like Hilton and Amazon who are starting to use the platform. And then eventually, I think like we'll expand to contractors. And the idea here is like to create value for everybody on the project team to use Acelab as a system of record. Now, we're learning about the nice things in that from an Autodesk or Revit, but we're also learning about what we should be doing differently that the people who use a Revit are generally, really annoyed by. So one big area for us is heavily relying on user feedback. That's, I think, like probably the biggest reason, apart from all the technology that we've built, probably the biggest reason why some of the top firms in the industry have trusted Acelab is when they share the feedback with us, we take it very seriously and we act on it immediately. And I think that's really important, just because, the needs of two architecture firms are always, will be slightly different. So our goal is to create the infrastructure for the industry, regardless of like who you are, how you function, what your standards are internally, to make sure that you can use Acelab to, like you can adapt Acelab to yourself, as opposed to in some other tools, like especially the legacy tools, which require like hours of training for new team members and really slows down the efficiency of the architecture firm. And most often, if not anything else, require the architecture firm to re-engineer everything that they've been doing internally, only to fit themselves into the platform. I think that's wrong. And I think like that in this industry is probably a big deterrent for architecture firms with new technology. But if you have infrastructure, which architecture firms can make their own, I think that's really valuable. And again, like, in the software world, there's great examples of that with like Airtable or Notion, which are like infrastructure. Like, it's not necessarily that every time you use a tool, you have to use a certain way, but you can like really make the tool of your own. That's how I see Acelab expanding.
Oh, that's great. And as an architect, I can see I can say it's the right way, right? Like every project is different, every firm is different, and you need a lot of customization and a lot of flexibility to adapt to your processes. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know you're a busy guy, so I'm not gonna ask you many more questions. But before we wrap this up, can I ask you a couple of ping pong questions?
Please do, yeah.
Can you tell me what's the next big trend in the AC?
The next big trend in AC would be everything where we don't have a system of record, which would require a high cost of change to get architecture firms to move away from that. So by that, I mean gen design, BIM, like the next evolution of BIM. I'm generally a little bit apprehensive of that, but that's just my view. I think in AEC at large, vertical integration in tools is probably the next big trend. So really like having tools that aren't like specialists in one single thing, but can really be the, like, an architecture firm at the end of the day should have 2 or 3 platforms that they need to rely upon. And ideally, those should be the platforms that also are valuable for other stakeholders they generally need to work with. Vardhan, I'm going to give you a small example of this, which will hopefully be fascinating for users as well. So we had our offsite with the leadership team last week, and Andre, who's our head of research, he was a technical architect. He spent like a decade or so at HOK and like so many amazing firms. Also was the earliest adopter of Revit. So here's how I think like things or softwares or tools evolve and grow rapidly in the industry. Once he was sold on Revit, then his next job for himself was to go to Arup and go to 2 or 3 other firms, engineering firms or interior design firms that they would routinely work with. This was still while at HOK, to show them demos, to do demos of Revit for them, to convince them, let's use this from now on. And I think that is the most important thing in this industry. At the end of the day, nobody really cares what I have to say about Acelab, but if other architects are hearing about Acelab from other architects, that is the most meaningful thing. And again, like I think it goes back to needs to be end-to-end, needs to be valuable for not just the architecture firm internally, but also other folks, on the outside.
Absolutely. Great answer. And if you have to name a great tool in the AC, we know Acelab is great, so you cannot say Acelab. So you have to name another one. It can be a really old one like AutoCAD, or it could be a new one like X.
Yeah, that's a tough question, because you and I both have a lot of friends in AC Tech. I don't want to give anybody an edge or disappoint the others with my answer.
Not your favorite. Just say, let's put it like that. Let's just say one that comes to your mind.
Yeah. This will be a slightly left field, but I would say Miro. I think Miro is one of those tools which was not, I don't think they even thought about like how architecture firms really, really love the tool or like tried to, like to market to us. But that again, to me, is a sign of a great tool. It organically spread from architects saying, hey, whiteboarding, we're all remote, let's use Miro. And the other thing I really like about it is it's infinitely flexible. So you could use, I know of firms that use it to organize their mood boards. I know firms who use it for the presentations with clients, whiteboarding, brainstormings, internally to keep track of stuff they're doing. So sorry, I'm not trying to not name an AC tool, but I do feel like it's a really good tool.
It was a really great way of avoiding it, but it counts. So no worries. And then last but not least, what's your favorite building in the world, and if you have ever visited?
Yeah, I get that asked a lot. And I would say my favorite is probably Foundation Louis Vuitton. For anybody that hates Frank Gehry, they're going to be like, oh my God, this guy doesn't know anything about architecture. But I like that building. I don't know if you've been there, close to Paris. One of the projects which like really speak or tell the story of the materials. So for me, the details on a project are something I love to geek over. And in that project, it's everything from like wood going up to steel, and then you have all these like very well designed, like like the corners or joints or steel members, all the way to the glass on the outside. So again, being obsessed with the materials on a project, I feel like that is a great representation of how architectural systems work.
That's a cool building. I mean, architecture is objective, so you can say any building and nobody can say anything, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I'm sure as an architect, you would agree that there are some wrong answers.
I mean, yeah, sure. Like you could say that I mean the walkie-talkie in London or like any. There are really awful buildings out there. That's true. Before we say goodbye to each other, can you tell everybody where they can know more about Acelab or contact you as well?
Yeah. Well, talk to your friends. There's a good chance you might hear about Acelab. You might be surprised there's somebody at your firm already using Acelab. So that's always a great place to start. Otherwise, you can go on our website, acelabusa.com. It's totally free for architecture firms to use everything from the research to building a library on the platform. We've also got amazing architects on our team who now help other architecture firms to improve the processes for material decision making. So on the website, you'll also see a way to book a demo with them, and we'd be happy to, like, regardless if you're in a BIM role at the firm or design technology or architecture or a PM, we'd be happy to show you what is the business case for you, your role specifically, and your firm to be using a platform like Acelab.
All right. Thanks so much for your time, Vardhan, and looking forward to see the progress Acelab is making out there in the future. All right.
Thank you so much for having me on, Valentin. And I do want to just say, give you a shout out for doing this for the industry. I know so many folks in the industry, they look up to you as a thought leader. And I think it's a wonderful thing you're doing to build a community here with all of us on the AEC tech side. You are like the interface layer, and then there's architects and the other folks at firms. And I really like the idea of this being an ecosystem.
Thanks so much for the kind words. So I hope anything I do can help other young architects. So
yeah,
happy that it's making something in the community. So
you're making a big difference. Yeah.
Thank you. You too. I mean, you're making an amazing product. So thanks so much for your time, and talk to you later. All right.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks to our listeners. If you like this content, you can find past and upcoming episodes in ascworks.everse.com and at all of our Everse social media. We'd love to hear from you and recommendations for new content, so leave us a DM and we'll make sure to catch it.